Anyway, Duncan's going to talk to us about the laboratory that he runs and some of the experiments and studies. And please give a warm welcome to my friend Duncan.
Thank you. Great to be here. Director of Technical Services, RA. The RA actually stands for Public Department. I got my license to practice architecture and then realized how much I had not known and do not know about how buildings are. And I think that's a travesty in earnest. So thank you for coming to my meeting. My name is Duncan. I'm a recovering architect, and I'm going to talk to you about a variety of things that we're doing at CUNY BPL. We're not a laboratory, actually, Joe. We're just a lab. I've been taken as past by my directors about we're just a lab. We're within the City University of New York network. It's a community college. We work within the City College of New York in the engineering school. We do a number of things. We have an energy data group that works on stuff. I run our technical services team. We also have a training department working with commercial building operators. So we do a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. I need to give you some of the org chart. My boss, Honey Burke, is a fantastic woman. I love her to death, but we also have sort of a shadow network on our reporting structure. We've got Deal and Peanut. They are a couple of operatives. I'm here to plant the flag for cats because cats rule and dogs drool. So all the dogs, I can't even go there because then there's an inappropriate thing about my gender and all that stuff. I'm owned by an operator, the asset. So how did I get into this? Well, I've always been sort of a curious person, and my father was a school teacher, and he had 4 kids, and I was born in 1963, and when I was about 8 years old, the oil embargo happened, and my father, being a Depression-era baby, had a thrifty idea. Let's take the kids and the truck and the chainsaw and go cut trees down for our neighbors in Connecticut. And the kids can take the wood home and split it, chop it, stack it, burn it. So I spent many of my formative years knowing exactly how many BTUs are in a cord of wood and exactly how much energy it takes of my labor to burn that wood to keep my bedroom at 50 degrees so the pipes wouldn't freeze. And so, that got me interested in buildings and energy, and I took a circuitous route, did some solar energy studies in high school, went to Rhode Island School of Design, where energy was got my license, found Joe, found this community, and I'm like, yeah, this is what I really want to do. And so I've been doing it in one form or another for quite some time. So a lot of what we do is, what I do, and our group is primarily tasked with doing measurement verification for DCAS, VEM. They're the entity that pays all the power and light bills for the city of New York for over 5,000 or 6,000 buildings that the city owns and operates. And they have their own internal sort of utility program, for lack of a better term. They fund energy upgrades across that portfolio in a variety of different ways. And so our group has been tasked with trying to look at those things, look at those retrofits and say, are they actually performing the way they should in the first place, and how do they compare with the energy audit that was done on the building that created the possibility of doing that project. I'm also going to talk a little bit about, or primarily about, this DOE-funded research project I've been working on for the past few years, looking at all the energy data associated with the buildings of New York City and what does it tell us. So that's kind of what I'm going to go through. I won't hit every caveat here, but all of this has been funded either by the Department of US DOE or DCAS VEM, and so I have to thank them very much. These are also all my opinions and my conclusions, so they can't be held responsible. And I'm the face of a really great team at BPL. So I know enough to know to ask the question, and I know enough to have a lot of people behind me that can do the work that can answer the question. And so I really, without them, none of this would be possible. But, and also, I got into thinking about looking at all this data of these buildings, thinking, every building has a building ID number, every building, all these different data sets should be really easy to match them up. We spent the majority of our time cleaning and figuring out how to manipulate the data rather than doing the analysis. So I've only sort of, I think, scratched the tip of the iceberg that we might be able to answer in some of these, in some of this data set. So, why passive-regressive? Well, a big part of what we do, from an energy modeling perspective, we don't do a lot of 8760, what we call forward models. We don't build a simulation of a physics-based model and look at what it thinks it's doing. We look at the utility data, and we regress that typically against outside air temperature. And so we can go from a time series to a change point model, and this is telling us what the relationship is of temperature and energy performance in that building. And so, this is kind of a fundamental piece of what we're doing, and there are different types of change point models, right? There's these, a flat slope. You've got the 3P models, a 3-parameter model where you've got sort of stable base load of energy working, and then, as the temperature increases or decreases, the energy use goes up, representing the heating and cooling loads. You could have 4-parameter models where you've got many of these new electrified buildings are going to either be a 4 or 5-parameter model because they're using the same energy source for heating and cooling over time. And these coefficients of how steep the slope is and where the baseline is and where the change point is, all of these can help tell you some things about the buildings. So you can do, you can look at how much base load you've got, how much, how fast is the building, what's the rate of energy consumption as the outside air temperatures change. And where the change point is, right? Like at the point it goes from a base load to a heating or cooling slope, like, you want to see maybe on a heating model, 65, 63 degrees, something like that. If you see that heating model changing at 75, well, why are you heating the building when it's 75 degrees outside, right? Maybe something's wrong with how the building's operating. So you can look at that, and we also use these models across the DCAS portfolio to help them understand sort of their energy parameters, or their audits. A very steep cooling slope might indicate a problem with the cooling system. You may not need to audit the whole building. Maybe just do a cooling system audit, right? Just look at how you're cooling. So we've developed a modeling tool called BEMA. It's an internal tool at the moment. There is a very similar tool that's available through LDNL. They call it Better, I think. It's a Python package, so you can do all of what I'm showing here, on your own. But it uses monthly utility data, and part of what we do with this is also use it as a measurement verification tool for whole building analysis. So, these are some screenshots of it again. Cooling model, or electric versus natural gas. You've got a 68-degree change point there for heating. You've got about a 65-degree change point for cooling. And so we use this tool in conjunction with a couple of these standards. Actually, Guideline 14, the IPMBP, are both sort of industry documents and standards for doing measurement verification. Talks a little bit, the IPMBP, I say, is basically, it's a framework to set up a contract between consenting adults for energy-saving projects, right? So everybody knows what everybody's doing, and here's how we're going to calculate the savings, here's what we're going to measure, here's, all of those things get spelled out, and the IPMBP goes through that. Guideline 14 has a lot of similar information, but has a lot more information about how to measure things and what to measure. So if you've got a boiler, what can you do with your boiler to measure it? Or you've got a chilled water plant or something like that. There are also some good guidelines that came out of FEMP, and the Environmental Power Administration have some decent protocols. So this is just an example of one project we did. I've got a bright young engineer working with us. DCAS has been funding, DEM is doing probably at this point hundreds of direct install lighting retrofits in schools and police stations across their portfolio. And they're like, well, we'd like to see how they work. And we're like, well, usually you've got to wait a year to get a year's worth of monthly data on the post-retrofit to do a traditional sort of change sweat model. But we said, well, a lot of these schools have 15-minute interval data through a platform they have, or many utilities now you can access your own 15-minute data. So we said, okay, let's take the 15-minute data, aggregate it up into different day types. So we look at weekdays, weekends, school year, summer year. And by splitting those models up, we were able to come up with 2 different daily, day type models, and a pre-retrofit. And basically, the area under the curve, the difference between the two is that's the energy savings. So this is a time series, but we're now able to do this not after a year, but we can do this, effectively a month after the retrofit's complete, because we're using sort of daily data, provided we recognize that the day type we're using is similar or could be extrapolated out over the course of the entire year. So, so it's kind of, it's a neat tool to be using. And this is kind of, the results of regular weekdays, unoccupied days. And we're now using this and taking a look at what the consultants, estimate of savings were to see, okay, we can't exactly tell what is correct or incorrect about their assumptions necessarily, but we can sort of get a reasonable ballpark thing, were they, what percent savings, and how much energy were they actually, predicting to save. So it's, I've never seen this until I sort of had seen this a little bit, but it to me struck me as a very powerful tool. And working in New York City over the last 4 or 5 years, I saw that in the department, in New York City, they have legislation that says any data set that the city collects has to be posted and published to the public, right? And so I started looking at these different data sets and like, cool, there's energy benchmarking that happens for the last 10 years. There's, I was like poking around, there's the Department of Health collects the make and model number of every cooling tower that exists in the city of New York. Why would the city? Legionella, right? They want to know where those cooling towers are, right? So weird reasons that data gets collected for different things. All the building permits are publicly available. You can see any building permit you want. And so I was like, DOA came out with a station and think, well, we're looking for some energy code analysis. And I'm like, well, we could maybe look at buildings, look at what was built and when it was built and how much energy it's using and sort of do this thing. It was basically kind of a fishing expedition of data. And they said, yeah, go for it. So, we grabbed that. At the same time, there's this, these are the local laws that have gone into effect. Some require benchmarking, some require energy audits, Local 197, and I'm going to use these acronyms a little bit here, but LO97 is, it's the veto or bureau or whatever for Massachusetts. Regulates how much energy you can use. So I was writing this proposal at about the same time this law was coming into effect. And I was like, so you're going to fine building owners for exceeding an amount of energy that they may not, they sort of have been looking at for their EY, but I don't know that they really understand it or know what it is. And these things are popping up all over the country, you know, building performance standards, statewide. This is from April this year. There may be even more of them that have gone into effect. But, you know, it's in concept fairly simple, but, you know, do you really know how much energy you're using? We heard, you know, train your tenants for 6 months and your energy goes down, and then the next 6 months it goes up. So how do you really understand and predict what's going to happen? So I saw it kind of in a, you know, the analogy I started putting into my head was like, okay, well, I've got a car, right? I drive a Prius. I want to go from Sheboygan to Perth Amboy. I get about 47 miles a gallon, and I've got 4 5-gallon containers of gas in my car. But I don't have any other data, right? I'm just going to drive. I can't see how fast I'm going. I can't see how much, you know, when the car runs out of gas, I know I need to put more in, but beyond that, I don't know. And so, you know, am I going to make it? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. It's the same thing with buildings, right? I'm a building operator. I've got this huge building, and I've got to keep everybody happy in that building, and I can't use more than, you know, X amount of tons of carbon dioxide. My building automation system is, as I've seen in virtually every building, it barely controls the building, let alone actually makes it do the things that you want it to do. It doesn't collect data. We've been trying to collect data with building automation systems, and we can trend maybe 10 points for 7 days. That's the storage capacity in these things. It's like crazy. Are you going to make it? I don't know. So as part of this project, I was also like, but we know we can trend and track various systems and components of the building. We know we can set up these sort of logical regression models about how much energy it's using at a different time. Maybe we can use this technique to predict the performance, or at least better understand the performance of the building without having to do an 8760 model, which we also, I'm not convinced anybody, I've never heard anybody say it's never a reality. They're useful, but they're not real. This is using real data about your real building to be able to say, okay, my chiller's using this much, my boiler's using this much, my plug loads on the lights might be using this much. So if I have a few simple meters on my building for various things, I can disaggregate all of the uses that are going on in here, and then I can put it into a predictive model. I can take that equation of what the slopes are and the change point, and I can push that into a typical meteorological year. It's going to be out, you know, take out your farmer's almanac, right? It's January. I think it's going to be a hot year, so maybe my boilers aren't going to run as much, so I can run it and see what my parameters are. And then on a month-to-month basis, I can also take that information and true up what I'm doing so that as I'm operating the building, I can make it better perform. I can also now sort of understand what are the relative contributions of all of these different systems in the building to my total fines, right? So as a building operator, or owner, I can now make more informed decisions about what I should be doing so I don't get, you know, I don't get fined at the end. So we created, kind of broke down all of the facilities into major system plant, what I call plant systems and components. So we got a plant, that plant's built up of components. We broke all those down and then created this sort of measurement points and measurement information that you could collect on that to calculate a certain attribute or characteristic of that component or plant or system. So this is all put together. We correlated this to something called Project Haystack, which is a building automation system tagging protocol or standard, so that if people want to use it in their BAS and their new implementations, there are some tags that are associated with those things as well. So that's something we got put together. And as part of this, we then said, okay, let's kick the tire on it. Does it work? So we accessed some data from the New York State Research Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA. They have a program for putting real-time energy monitoring systems and management systems in buildings. They shared some data with us on chillers and pumps and cooling towers. So we had end-use data for a number of buildings. And so we used kind of the same concept of, okay, let's do a time of week and temperature model, which is something that came out of the Lawrenceburg lab. I mean, a lot of this is based on their work that's maybe 10, 12 years old now. But we can, you know, isolate out weekdays, weekends, Saturday work, Sunday work, and then, you know, start looking at that and comparing that to the energy data that was available to us from some of these other open data sources. So we had, for 3 years, 2018, 19, and 20, we had monthly utility data for all these buildings in New York City. And it's published on the open data website if anyone cares to look at it. But we then took that and ran it, you know, we built the model and then ran the model based on the actual weather days, and you can see that, you know, in different years where you have different average outside air temperatures, you're going to get different energy consumption.
What's the blue and red?
The blue is the chiller, the red is the total. Okay, so so the blue is the sum of those loads based on the change point. So this is like the relative contribution on a monthly basis of how that chiller is working. So it's you know, we think it's a reasonable tool. Love to, if anybody is interested in, you know, getting tires with this stuff, let me know, because we're going to use it with some of the stuff we do, but if anyone's out there doing this sort of M&D work, please dig in. So we also looked at all this open data, right, 2013 to 2022. And, you know, these are kind of the key benchmarks, the key, you know, flags of what's happened when in the New York City landscape. So all buildings started to get benchmarked through the portfolio, the EPA portfolio manager. The law went into effect in 2011 or 2010, the first, 2009, I think. First year they were benchmarked was 2011. The first year of reasonable data we feel is actually useful is probably 2013. And it's, you know, and moving on from there, they increased the stringency, so it started out 50,000 square feet, and now 25,000 square feet is the limit. So there's roughly 30,000 buildings in New York City, over 30,000 buildings that are getting benchmarked every year. Okay, it's a lot of data. And then we've got monthly data of all those buildings as well. So, you know, what are some of the things we looked at? What did we find? This is a Sankey diagram of the fluctuation in EUIs over the years, right? Like we binned the EUIs by 50 EUI points. Because, you know, I'm thinking, well, as a building owner, I walk around the city, I go to visit my friends, right? Another law mandates you have to post your energy score on your door of your building. So I go to their building one year, it's a B. I go there the next year, it's a C. You know, it's like, well, I don't, you know, how much fluctuation is there? I mean, that was something I was kind of interested in. And when they passed Local Law 97, they also put in that law that it used to be that anybody could enter the energy data and the square footage in the portfolio manager to come up with your EUI. So there's no, you know, it's like chicken's guarding the hen, you know, fox is guarding the hen now. So maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but there was no penalty for it. The only penalty there was, and eventually they said, nah, you have to put a grade on it. Okay, well, big deal. People aren't going to rent my apartment or not because I have a B or a C on my door. That's not a thing, right? Well, maybe. So we kind of stack this up, looking at, you know, but this is kind of showing the chain. You know, there is a lot of fluctuation here. So sometimes building owners are going to get fined, and sometimes they're not, based on how things move around, right? But we also looked at over the years what is the percentage, and in 2020 they said, okay, for this Local Law 97, because we're now actually putting teeth to it, you're going to pay a fine if your building's not done. You have to have a registered design professional enter your information in. And, by the way, you're going to get fined eventually if you're not doing this correctly, because all the fines are based on your EUIs that go into portfolio manager, and the energy that goes into it. And interestingly, it's like, starting in 2020, everything, like, the percent, there's a lot of percentage moving around from year to year up to 2020, and then it's kind of like, it's like, And we've had discussions, is it COVID, is it, what happened and what, and, we looked at this for multifamily, the same sort of thing. You get kind of this leveling off, and my boss was like, well, COVID happened, and buildings should have been using a lot more energy in multifamily because people are living there now and working from home. And I'm like, I don't think they were operating multifamily buildings fundamentally different, regardless of whether someone is in it 24 hours a day or not. Yeah, plug loads might have changed a little bit, but, so kind of an interesting, an interesting finding and I'm hoping that I can find funding to keep moving forward with this, and we're having discussions with the Department of Buildings, who is the legislative authority managing and having to impose fines and do all this stuff. But it was kind of cool. And then we said, okay, well, why don't we split these buildings up by quartiles? And this is an unreadable, busy graph, but basically we said, so how wide a range of UIs are we seeing in various building types, right? We looked at the 4 largest building types: office, multifamily, K-12 schools, and hotels, and sort of said, is there any, do we see anything, is there any trends that we can infer based on size, right? Is a multifamily building that's smaller versus bigger? Does it have different characteristics? And elevators or other things in it that cause its UI to change? We really didn't see across all these building types, we didn't see any real trends in terms of size being a driver of how much energy these buildings are using. Another analysis point would be, something to be interesting is, like, another in data is, there's a 3D model of the city of New York that you can export into Rhino or use in ArcGIS. So we could actually go through and capture all of the surface areas of these buildings, and we could do an analysis on the surface area. We could try, there's a lot of different variables that are out there that we can start looking at things on. But again, unfortunately, most of our time was spent getting the data into shape to do the analysis rather than doing the analysis. So this is how I'm trying to, keep things, see if we can move that forward. I've seen this graph many, many times in many iterations over the years. And so another part of this was, so how well are buildings performing based on when they were built, right? In theory, the energy codes have been getting better and better and better and better over time. So we went through and we did the same disaggregation, took the quartiles and said, okay, based on sort of the code cycles that exist in the city of New York and the year built that was from another data set, how do they work? Is there any, is there any trends? And yeah, in multifamily, we're actually, we're seeing that they're getting better on average. There's still outliers and there's still, quite a bit of spread in the UIs, but generally speaking, they're getting better. But K-12 schools, pre-1980 schools are working just as well as schools that were built in 2006, 2014. And why do they go up and then down, right? These are some of the, I don't know. So it's interesting. Definitely a downward trend for multifamily, which is good to see. All the other ones sort of look like the K-12, sort of the scatter shot of, some up, some down. Doesn't seem to have any real trends to that end. So with Local 197, one question we also had was how many of these buildings are going to comply and are not comply. And the calculations for these are a little bit, it's a little bit challenging. You've got they have EUI, they have targets for every year. They've got different targets for different year. There's 2 primary compliance periods I'm looking at here, which is the first compliance period, 2024 to 29. And so there's a grid emissions factors that you have to use. So you've got to break out all your energy sources, and there's carbon per energy source. And then there's the targets that you have to meet per square foot. And then they've got a whole different set of targets, or another set of targets in 2020, 2030, 2034. And then there's other calculations. They're assuming that the grid is going to get cleaner in New York, so the electric emissions factor is different in 2030 than 2034. But generally speaking, there's going to be a fair number of buildings that are out of compliance in the 2030 to 2034 range. So people are either going to be paying $268 a ton of carbon that they're over their caps for, or they're going to be, doing retrofits. So, it's, and I've never, I'm hoping somebody else has done this analysis too. I really hope I'm not the only one. But these are the caps per, per square foot. And they're getting pretty aggressive in the 2030 to 2034 range. You saw a similar thing on the lawsuit slide. They're 50, 60% more aggressive. Yeah.
So you said 268 a ton. I mean, so for a typical building, is that 5,000 a year or 50,000?
Funny you should ask that. The question was, what will it cost? What, $268 a ton, well, none of us, and half of us here almost can think in BTUs and kWh, right? The gallons of oil, right? And how many they should use. But how much will this actually impact somebody? And I love, I've sort of asked this question and I haven't really gotten an answer. Steve was nice enough to say it hasn't been worried, as Steve Bluestone, the owner of multifamily buildings. We're looking at fines in the range. These are in thousands of dollars. So we're talking $25,000 and up, $50,000 and up in the first compliance period. But in 2030, you're getting 2,500 buildings are going to be somewhere between $0 and $25,000 of fines for their building. More interesting to me is the dollar per square foot. And this is, again, some of the analysis, and I love any of you who are out there doing the financial models for buildings. Like, what does $1 a square foot mean in your pro forma? Right? That's the next question I want to get answered. So if anyone can tell me that, carry me afterwards. We're seeing fines anywhere from 25 cents upwards of $2 a square foot for some of these buildings. And those are multifamily, this is office buildings. A lot more of them are getting out of compliance and in a big way in the 2030 time frame. And the difference between those, this is the total fine, right? So they're going to be, over 100 buildings with over $200,000 of fine. But you don't see that bump here because this is normalized by square footage. So those big buildings that have a $200,000 fine might have a huge number of square feet. So their dollar per square foot might only be 25 cents, right? Or 20 cents per square foot. But, could be a significant source of revenue for the city. I was also, again, this is a codes problem, codes research. So I was like, what about new construction, right? I'm an owner, I just bought a new building. Am I going to be in compliance? Well, this is where it's challenging. In New York, they only really started tracking the compliance path for the building permit in 2015. Okay, so they gave us data from 2015 to date, or 2020, I guess 2021 when they gave us the data. We only had about 218 buildings in that data set that we could find. There were maybe 5,000 or so that had been permitted, but we only had 281 that actually had energy data. Because in New York, it takes a while to build a building and occupy it to get it running. So, there are three compliance pathways. There's sort of a prescriptive tabular pathway. There's the ComCheck modeling, and there's full-on energy modeling for the building. And so, you know, not much difference between either the ASHRAE code or the New York Energy Code. What's kind of interesting here is that, you know, the ComCheck buildings with the New York Energy Code don't seem to be doing too well, whereas the buildings that are using a prescriptive tabular approach for their energy compliance seem to be, you know, will be perhaps doing better, I don't know. And the energy modeling, again, doesn't necessarily tell you how they're performing. So, I presented this at the National Codes Conference a few months ago, and a few people at DOE were like, yeah, I always wondered how these model buildings are performing. I'm like, well, yeah, so we have the data now. And this is why I would love to be able to continue this process, because, you know, in 5 more years, there's going to be a lot more buildings. And, you know, I was talking to Kat, last night, I'm like, we can now pick out the Fiat buildings in New York City and start looking at them and putting them into this mix, or the LEED buildings, or the, you know, other certification programs. So those are kind of things that would be interesting with this data, I think, on a kind of forward-moving basis. I also naively, you know, I'm an architect, what do I know? New York City has this EN1 document, it's a spreadsheet. I mean, a spreadsheet, great data. That you're supposed to fill out. If you're doing an energy model, you're supposed to fill this, you know, huge spreadsheet, lots of tabs. Every input in your energy model goes into the spreadsheet. And I'm like, man, if we're doing a data mining project, that, you know, that should be easy. That would be really cool stuff to look at. Turns out I didn't do my homework when I wrote the proposal, because after the Department of Building says, yeah, we get all that, but those are just printed on PDFs on the drawing set. We don't have this spreadsheet. All right, now I'm going to the computer science school and asking for interns who are data scrapers to figure out how do we get this information off these drawing sets. So we did some data scraping. We got far less information, but you know, there's a usage table on every one of these, which is the model usage for the baseline building and the model usage for the proposed building. So we were able to scrape these. I think we got about 127 of these buildings scraped and have a database. There were only 27 of those buildings that had any energy benchmarking data available in 2022. So lo and behold, as this graph so eloquently shows, by showing randomness, there is no correlation between energy consumption and the energy model. One of the number 25, actually, the EUI for 25, these are all EUIs somewhere in the 20, 30, 40 range. The building 25 had an EUI of 600. I mean, it's like order of magnitude more. And we didn't dig into that to really try to identify it, because it got permitted and the proposed was better than the baseline. So it got its permit. So the yellow one is the baseline model. The green one is the proposed construction model. And the blue is the actual energy use of the building. These are all converted to tons of carbon, but the actual consumption. So, you know, from left to right, baseline model, proposed model, and then 2022 actual energy consumption, right? So some are over, some are under, some are about the same, and I can't believe anybody's actually who's owning these buildings are looking at this. But you know, the other thing we then said, okay, well if we now translate this energy consumption of the tons of carbon into fines, how many of these buildings are going to get fined? It's only about 4 of these out of the 27 that are going to have some kind of fine. The red bars, the candy stripe documents what the fines are going to be, or the underage for these buildings. So you know, they're not going to be in bad shape relative to fines, but it's just, it again goes back to the concept of like, well, I have an energy model, but if my energy model, it can't even tell me what I'm doing with, or how the building's really going to perform. Is it that much use? I don't know. So we also took a look at energy audits, right? right? Local ID 7 requires every building over 50,000 square feet every 10 years has to get audited, retrocommissioned. You have to recommendations need to be made for energy upgrades in those buildings. All of this is getting entered into the US DOE's web platform called Audit Template. So again, all of it's turned into data in partnership with the city. They were able to work with us and BNL to export all of those BSXML files. BSXML is Building Sync XML schema. So that we could actually start, parse through all of those recommendations and try to take a look at it. So what are the, a lot of different sort of categories of ECMs that get recommended. Lighting is the big, the big one for boiler plans, and a fair amount of variation from, and these are broken down by building type, right? So each of the lines represents either office, multifamily, K-12, or hotel, from left to right. But kind of, looking at, offices and hotels have a lot of other motors, whereas multifamily don't. And chiller plants, we see almost none in multifamily, which makes sense because there are very few chiller plants in multifamily buildings, right? The same window air conditioning in New York City. So some of these things were kind of, they made sense. But then we said, okay, why don't we break these down by use type and by quartile, right? Naively, I'm thinking, well, better buildings probably have a different set of measures recommended than worse buildings, right? You can grab the low-hanging fruit in your worst building to get it better versus, other things, right? You're not going to replace a boiler that's working well in a high-performing building, you might think. But we didn't. There's not a lot of variation in these recommendations from the worst to best building, right? It's sort of, about the same. In offices, we were seeing, we see some spikes, but it's an illogic. It's like the worst, your best performer is getting a lot of lighting retrofits, and your poor, your not so good is getting the same number, but then the good and worst performers are getting fewer. Like this isn't following some logic that I can think of. So we, the difference that we also started recognizing, thinking about, K-12 schools are a single owner, the city of New York, right? City of New York, we work with them closely, we know what their audit processes are, we know what their focus and their goals are, and so we have a little bit more insight into those compared to office buildings or multifamily buildings or hotels, which are all privately owned by a whole bunch of different people who have, people with great intentions, people who are, and he says they're slumlords, right? They're, they want to spend nothing on the building, right? So you have a wide range of these things. So we started saying, okay, which buildings have the most recommendations? Lighting, surprise, surprise, comes up on top. But upgrading your building automation system, sensors, adding pipe insulation, right? Okay, that's going to save a huge amount of money, I'm sure. But VFDs, not a lot, and doing things, air sealing the envelope did come up in a number of these areas, which is good to hear. Window replacements, but kind of a smorgasbord of various measures that don't to me seem to make any sense. And so we kind of started asking questions: do these audit? Is this like a drive-by audit? Right? Yep, there it is. Okay, I'll fill it in. So we looked at by auditor, right? We took the top 10 auditors. I would probably say that we have the multifamily buildings as large data sets is probably more representative, K-12 schools. New York City has 5. They led a contract for 5 different audit companies every 3 years, so there's a fairly fair consistency of that. So I think those are the two that probably have the most relevance. So we kind of went through by all of these buildings and put through their percentages of which auditor was recommending what. And lo and behold, like auditor 4, 5, and 6, they each did 56 multifamily buildings. To me, I'm not a statistician, I think that's probably a reasonable sample. Look at the spread between the number of recommendations for boiler improvements from Auditor 6 to Auditor 4, right? 95% of the buildings they audited, they said boilers need work. 30% in Auditor 5. Like, yeah, I think there's some bias going on in these. You know, similarly, like renewable energy systems or plug load reductions, right? Auditor 6, 73% of those buildings need plug load reductions. Auditor 5 didn't find one plug load reduction opportunity in any of the buildings they audited, right? And then, you know, looking at, comparing that to K-12 schools, single client, focused priorities, right? They actually tell the auditors they want to know certain things. Should we be getting lighting in this building? Should we be doing motors and drives? Should we be doing a few things? And you know, the spread is far less in the K-12 schools than what we saw. You know, this is the spread of percentages across all of these different categories, right? So multifamily, we've got a huge spread of variation between auditors and how many recommendations they were making in each category compared to the K-12 school. Somebody told me I should do standard deviation. I'm not sure why. I'm not a statistician, but again, smaller standard deviation in K-12 schools, larger in the offices and the multifamily housing group. So yeah, I think auditors are, you know, they've got their pet report, and they, you know, Joe taught me years ago, write one good report and then recycle it, right? and
saves a lot of carbon.
yeah. Well, except for the money that needs to be printed to get, you know, to pay for that. You know. So that's kind of some highlights of what we've been doing. We've got a bunch of other things going on. We're playing with big air handlers and airflow, trying to understand how to measure that, because a lot of measures we're seeing are airflow related, like demand controlled ventilation. And if you don't know how much outside air is coming into the building, you kind of can't calculate how much savings you're getting from whether the PCD got implemented correctly or not. So we're playing with that. I'm not going to say much more, but maybe if we do get to a point where we can talk about it, maybe we can share that with you guys at some point. We're also working on some standards for building automation systems. Not some of the standards, but best practice characterization, best practice things you could put into a BAS that would enable you to better do measurement and verification and long-term operational verification of your systems. So instead of thinking of a BAS as something simply to control, have it be a feedback loop that makes it better and easier for you to control the building better, right? And there's we feel a very small incremental cost in some slight additional sensors and additional measurement instrumentation and storage capacity that you can then program a BAS to give you real-time feedback. You wouldn't have to do these regression models necessarily, because you've got real data on how much your chiller is using on a daily basis, how much your boiler is using, how much, and use that as a way to confirm that what you're doing, and then again, you could be in Florida looking at your data set. You know, as a management tool, you can now know whether your building operators are doing the right thing. And so we're working on some of that, again, with DEM, because they're making huge investments in building automation systems. And so we're saying, if you're spending all this money to try to control the building better, why don't you spend just a little bit more to understand how it's working? And then we've done quite a bit of work, and soon to be published on the nycenergytools.com website, which is right now primarily a repository of field equipment that can be lent to any city employee, any building operator in the New York City portfolio to measure how their building's doing. We've got data loggers, we've got plant meters, we've got flow meters, we've got air balancing codes, we've got all kinds of stuff. So we've been using that to develop kind of using the ASHRAE guidelines, using some of the BPA guides and our own common sense, putting together a website that helps people come up and apply a standard way of measuring different systems of different devices in the building. So we've got that, it's probably going to go live sometime in the next couple of months, but you know, anybody would welcome feedback on this. So, in conclusion, no, I am not a single childless Catholic. But birds are not real. They are purely for surveillance. I live on a lake upstate New York during the summer. They also, you know, so there's aerial surveillance, but there's also submarine surveillance going on. We've got ones on the lake, and we know when one's driving by the dock, we're just like, yep, Peanut's up there, got his hands on the dials, twisting the dials. So I want to thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.